This is part 11, chapter 11 of What If the Kamado Siblings Parted Ways. Link in description. If you enjoy this chapter, then like, comment, and subscribe for more. Chapter start. Branching Paths by Skyward Strike. Chapter 11, Fire and Steel. Tanjiro Kamado held the wooden blade in his hands low, panting out heavily as a cloud of steam left his mouth. It was cold, near unbearably cold. The sweat running down his forehead was nearly frozen solid, and the several bruises that already lined his body didn't help either. But he knew better than to focus on anything but the opponent standing across of him, who also held a bakken of his own raised. The flames of 13 torches flickered around him in the cold night wind, the ground covered in a feet-deep layer of snow. Without any indication at all, he just moved, and closed in distance in a matter of moments. His blade descended upon its target, only to be blocked easily, and the same thing happened the next 2 times he did so. Except the second time his opponent would knock his wooden sword aside and raise his own blade. For a moment, it seemed as if the bakken in his hands had disappeared entirely, and the next it was being thrust at high speeds inches from making contact with his face. He grunted as the wood grazed the side of his face as he dodged and knocked it aside, moving back for a moment only to dash in again with vigor renewed. He would strike every blow with unrelenting vigor, yet it was like attacking a wall, and every single blow would be met by a bakken that might as well have been there before he even began swinging. Biting into his lower lip, he'd thrust his wooden sword right at his opponent, only to have it gently guided to the side as he fluidly moved past Tanjiro. Grunting, the boy would blindly raise his blade behind him to try and block the attack that he knew would come to his back, but instead felt it in his fingers as the bakken was disarmed of his hand. He grunted while stumbling, trying to turn around only to realize his foe wasn't there. The boy would pause for a moment, but wasn't even given the time to think as he suddenly felt an unfamiliar smell, and turned to look at the left instinctively. Only to the blade of bakken strike him across the face, knocking Tanjiro down to the ground. "You've really gotten a lot better," his teacher and opponent, Yorich, said to his downed pupil, lowering his own bakken. "But there are still vices in your swordsmanship we need to have you iron out." Tanjiro, though, found himself lying on the ground, staring up into the dark sky above as snow slowly fell around him. "Yes, master," he responded quietly, though something else was in his mind. He'd never seen that blow coming. Yet somehow, he knew exactly where it was going to land. What exactly had been the smell he'd felt a moment before the blow hit? Yorichi only nodded. "Now, get up, Tanjiro. I know there is fight in you yet." Tanjiro grunted, opening his eyes as he lay amidst rubble of a broken wall, grunting at his broken arm, holding onto his broken katana. It all felt broken, but his spirit wasn't. In fact, even upon waking up, he didn't focus on the pain he was feeling, nor on his damaged weapon, or rather on the dream he seemed to have had. He knew he'd only been out of it for a few seconds, but even then, he had a vision of his past as clear as day. Almost like his own subconscious was trying to tell him something. "That's right," he realized, narrowing his eyes slightly. "That's the smell I felt back then. The smell I began feeling near the end of my training. It was there back when I was fighting the Tamari demon too. But this was the first time I've felt it so clearly. Maybe because of my situation. Maybe because I was blinded for a second. Whatever the case, I think I finally get what I've been smelling all this time after all," the demon slayer thought. Pushing himself to sit up so as to look at the demon standing smugly a few feet from him, Lower Moon 6 Kamado, who, mostly due to that metallic skin of his, was giving him the toughest fight of his life thus far. "It's the intent of one's attack." "Oh, so you're still alive there," the demon moon noted with a grin from ear to ear. "I'm glad. For a second there I thought you would die early on me. Hard as I might try to hit you, I'd still much rather have you begging for your life before you go." "Sorry to disappoint," he said then, groaning as he struggled back to his feet using his good arm as support. The only good thing about the pile of rubble he'd been lying in was that it made it just a tad bit easier for him to get up rather than if he were down on the ground. Though that did nothing to help on the fact that currently in his body there were more things hurting than not. Harder than that was staying on his feet once he actually got up. There was a slight stumble, but he still managed to find a position where he could stand properly, before spitting out a mix of blood and saliva at the ground. The former leaving what seemed like a permanent taste of metal in his mouth ever since he'd gotten cut from chin to lip in what he already guessed would be a permanent scar. Supposing he managed to live that far. Regardless, Tanjiro was finally on his feet, and he'd take a deep breath while raising his broken katana at his opponent, his body bleeding, but his spirit focused. "I won't be begging today." Seeing this, Kamado couldn't resist, and finally burst laughing at the sight of his defiance. "Don't tell me you're serious. Look at yourself. You at your best could only make a scratch on me. Do you actually still think you have a chance of winning in your condition?" "Do I have to repeat myself?" Tanjiro asked him, his expression locked in a complete poker face. "I'll kill you. Cut your head off at the neck, with this very blade I'm holding. And you keep repeating that nonsense." Kamado said then, slightly annoyed at the human's bravado. "I understand it might have seemed sensible to you at the start, but things changed. If you can't see at least that much, maybe I've been hitting you a bit harder than I should have." "No, you're right," the demon slayer said then, narrowing his eyes while still showing nothing in his face. "Something's definitely changed." The demon looked at him, narrowing his eyes, not fully sure of what the boy had meant, but annoyed regardless. "I guess making you beg won't work after all," he admitted, both his arms morphing into blades as he stepped towards his target. "Then, I guess I'll just have to put you down without that satisfaction then." Tanjiro just narrowed his eyes as the demon began approaching. It was a worrisome situation, no doubt about it. He couldn't fight the same way as before, and even if he could, that did him no good in the first place. If he were to rely on that, he was dead meat. Therefore, his only choice was to rely on the one thing this him had over the one that engaged Kamado in the first place. That is to say the scent, the very same that had allowed him to dodge the earlier blow despite being blind, the same one that he recalled in his brief dream. Given he'd only utilized it to his advantage successfully this one time, it seemed like a ludicrous concept to rely on it, and yet he had nothing else to fall back on, so it was this or nothing. The demon would then rush in, and Tanjiro breathed in while closing his eyes. He heard Kamado's quickly approaching footsteps, but what he was really focused on was his sense of scent. It seemed like it took forever, with his opponent getting closer and closer, but he didn't move a muscle until the smell suddenly hit him and, once again, like instinct, he knew. "On my head." "From the left," he exclaimed, opening his eyes while ducking to the right, narrowly evading his opponent's bladed swing. The angered demon threw another blow, but even with his eyes opening, Tanjiro smelled his intention to attack nonetheless. "On my neck, from the right," he thought again, backing up to evade the lower moon's bladed arm by less than half a foot. "My chest, from the front." He sidestepped quickly in order to avoid having the demon moon's arm impale him. "Close," the swordsman noted, backing up while swinging his broken katana upwards to deflect one of his opponent's blows. Who in turn exhibited notable frustration at having none of his attacks land while still chasing him. "It only happens whenever it's just about to hit me. But I can definitely smell it. Every time. If I can keep my distance and use this smell to dodge whenever he gets close, I might be able to buy myself some more time." Kamado's attacks would continue coming as he moved after the swordsman, throwing swing after swing, slash after slash, only for Tanjiro to fall just out of range with each one. Sometimes by actual inches. "Why are you so persistent? Just get hit and die already," he demanded while rushing in at his opponent, swinging his blade in a quick sequence of blows that despite their proximity were all dodged by the demon slayer. With the exception of the last thrust, which was deflected and held away with their blades locked by his remnant of a katana. We both know there is nothing you can do to pierce my dark iron armor. You can keep on dodging for as long as you want. But next time you make a mistake and fall. He suddenly pushed Tanjiro back with his blade, sending the boy skidding a considerable distance back. I'll make sure you don't get back up again. Well, he's right. Tanjiro thought in frustration, I can dodge for as long as I can. But eventually my stamina will fail me and I'll make a mistake. I gotta figure out a way to get through the tough skin of his. But like he said, there's nothing I can do. He bit down onto his lower lip, knowing there must be some way to turn this to his favor, anyway. And then, he noticed something he didn't expect to take inspiration from. That being his broken white blade, for it held a red reflection on its side, one of something Tanjiro knew was behind him. And as he watched the reflection on his katana's metal of flames engulfing the pier behind him, it all seemed to click in a sudden epiphany. What an impossibly crazy plan, he thought with eyes widened, staring off into space, but, it's not like I have much of an alternative here. He was forced again out of his trance by the smell of an attack incoming, and he moved in order to avoid receiving a diagonal slash across the chest. Another series of swings were thrown, but each of them were deflected by Tanjiro's broken katana before he backed away by jumping back again. Despite in a way being a major disadvantage, he had to admit that in his current state, it was far easier to swing around his broken katana effectively than it had been the unbroken blade. That was another part of the reason where he was managing to keep pace with Kamado without having to push himself like he'd been doing. The demon was upon him the moment his feet had touched the ground though, and their fight continued its way down the street in a spectacle of metal and blood. The way they moved however might have even seemed like a dance to an onlooker, Kamado's crazed swings and restless assault being a violent dance of attack. While Tanjiro's careful and calculated movements, swinging his own blade solely in his defense and only when absolutely necessary, seemed like a dance of evasion instead. However, while the one attacking might have seemed like the one controlling the flow of battle, the secret was actually in their feet, with the human dodging quickly and often. His footwork moving from right to left, misguiding his foes not to have him catch on to his intentions, and yet slowly managing to bring them closer to the burning pier at the road's end. Soon enough, it would be impossible to hide where they were heading to from Kamado, and upon disengaging from the demon, he'd see a smile cross the lower moon's features as the burning pier finally caught his notice. Ah, quite beautiful, isn't it? This really looks like Hinamaru's doing. I bet if we go in there, we might find the crisped body of that other demon slayer friend of yours, he said as his smile turned into a cruel grin before he rushed in again. Well, whatcha say we take a look? Tanjiro grunted as he started being pressed towards the flaming pier behind them by the demon's attacks. He tried at one point to move past him, but predictably had a blade intercept his dash. He blocked it with his own katana and was sent skidding back towards the pier in question, just like he planned. After all, he couldn't make his plan too obvious for Kamado to catch on. The demon moon ran back at him to resume his offensive, which the swordsman continued evading while throwing the occasional botched attempt of getting past his foe and leaving the pier. But Kamado seemed way too focused on cutting him down to even notice as much while he intercepted the boy each and every time without failure. Soon enough, they'd start getting deeper into the pier, which meant fire now surrounded them on both ends, both from the pier and the smaller buildings atop of it. Tanjiro panted, the intense heat from the flames around them making it somewhat hard to keep pace while in there. Luckily, he was given a short reprieve when a flaming pole suddenly collapsed, nearly crushing the two of them and forcing demon and swordsman to disengage to opposite sides as the pole crashed onto the ground, its spreading flames separating the combatants. This however proved little of an obstacle for Kamado though, as the demon simply looked down at the pole for a moment before smirking and just walking past it, his dark iron armor protecting him from the fire and allowing him to get across the line of flames separating him from the demon slayer. Tanjiro though would take that brief reprieve to turn heel and run off further into the pier. As he kept going, the flames would grow bigger, hotter, and the smoke from it thicker. Tanjiro would found himself coughing, collapsing on a single knee on the grounds. He covered his nose and mouth with the sleeve of his haori. This will have to do, he thought to himself, knowing all he could do now was take a breather and wait for his opponent. Turns out though he wouldn't have to wait long. As soon enough he caught onto Kamado's scent and rolled to the side before he even emerged from amidst the smoke. His bladed arm stabbing down on the ground where the demon slayer had been moments earlier. Upon rolling out of the way though, the swordsman would take in a deep breath while he was still crouched before rising to dodge the demon's subsequent blows. For all that skill you have, it seems you're not all that smart after all. The lower moon noted, swinging viciously with both his bladed arms to keep pressure on his opponent. After all, you took this battle to somewhere you can barely breathe, surrounded by deadly fire that does nothing to me, he pointed out as he seemingly overswung, only to take the opportunity to spin around and swing his leg at Tanjiro just as it too morphed into a blade under the objective of claiming the human's head. Something it came very close to succeeding as he only evaded thanks to smelling the intent behind the attack in time. Regardless, this would force him to back up next to an entire flaming house, leaving him little escape when Kamado used the kick to toss himself towards the swordsman, preparing to impale him within his arm. Oh, well, who am I to argue with a man's choice for his grave? Tanjiro stood at the ready, feet shifting his stance as he lowered his broken blade. Behind him the flames consuming a building bathed him with burning heat, while before him an iron-coated demon moved in with the intent to kill. And yet, he chose to close his eyes and wait, focusing solely on his sense of smell. It wasn't as easy to get a clear read on the smell of an attack amidst all the smoke and ash, and it had very nearly cost him dearly a moment ago. Which is why he chose to focus solely on finding the scent and making it right on time. He exhaled a hot breath, his muscles burning in preparation of what was to come. Breath of the sun, 8th dance, he declared, causing Kamado to widen his eyes and jump in with his blade at the ready to stab the boy before he could pull off the technique. Which was when Tanjiro opened his eyes wide as the smell hit him. Parhelion Rainbow, the swordsman announced, not even bothering to raise his blade, and causing the demon to raise a confused eyebrow as to what he was doing right before his blade hit home, except rather than piercing right through Tanjiro, flesh, bone and muscle alike, it instead just went through him as if he was a mirage, leading to the blade hitting only the wall behind him. Which, combined with the weight and momentum put into the blow, caused Kamado to rush straight through the wall as the burning house collapsed on top of him entirely. Meanwhile Tanjiro would land from a triple flip over his opponent's head in a perfect arc and immediately collapse onto all fours as he felt both his lungs and muscles ache violently from him pushing himself through yet another breath of the sun technique despite his body's state. Parhelion Rainbow was the only evasive move of the breath of the sun, and often left behind an afterimage for a few moments after he moved. Which was how he was able to trick Kamado there in the first place. And speaking of which, he knew the demon wouldn't be held down behind the collapsed house for long. At least so far his plan seemed to have worked, but he was far from done yet. Breathing deeply, he rose again with some struggle, and just in time too, as the remnants of the house behind him were blasted apart. Kamado came walking out, looking tremendously annoyed as his dark iron armor shined a dark red from absorbing all the heat from the flames. His metallic chest now bare as he'd discarded his burning shirt. You really thought a parlor trick like that would be enough to get rid of me? He grunted out, raising both his blades crossed. Enough of this, boy. Just die already. The demon would rush in angrily, and for all of Tanjiro's pains and troubles, he noted that the demon's anger at least made him predictable. He dodged the attempt to scissor his head off with the two-hand blade by backing up, and moved to the side to evade a vertical swing that followed, as well as the horizontal one after that. His opponent lacked in technique with his blows, as well as in speed, even compared to a wounded Tanjiro since his metal weighed him down so much. His strength and defense might have been far out of the humans' league, and yet they were also obstacles to his opponent in and of themselves. Unchallenged, Kamado had grown unrefined in using his powers, and the only reason for being unchallenged in the first place was due to outlasting every single opponent. His ability forced every battle against a demon slayer into a war of attrition. It was because of this that Tanjiro was in the condition he was in the first place, his own mistakes piling up and weighing him down. But now he felt confident in his own win. Which was part of the reason why, when Kamado turned around to throw another blow on him, he'd instead be met with the remnants of the swordsman's blade instead slashing him across the eye. The demon moon would cry out in pain, and lash out at the swordsman immediately, only for him to back away the moment his blow hit. Kamado would groan out, covering his damaged eye as it healed while using the good one to glare daggers at Tanjiro. You're such a nuisance. Just do like every other and fall already, you damn demon slayer. He cried out, preparing to dash out in a blind rage right at the swordsman. Only to be surprised when the boy beat him to it and rushed in first instead. Grunting out, Kamado slashed at the approaching Tanjiro, but his sense of depth was obviously skewed as he missed by a fair margin, allowing the swordsman to use his momentum to leap in. Landing on the side of his blade mid-swing and using it as a mid-air stepping stone, before placing another foot right on the lower moon's head and using it to trampoline himself. Right over yet another burning house, landing on its other side, right on top of the rail separating the burning pier from the endless ocean that stretched to the horizon. While still crouched in the rail, Tanjiro would turn around, glancing briefly at the burning house he'd landed behind with narrowed eyes, before what he was expecting came. And a livid Kamado burst straight out of the burning wall, having seemingly just rushed straight through the house mindlessly, already slashing out with both blades at the swordsman. This, however, turned out to be a bit too much for the pier, which by itself was already heavily damaged by the flames. And both combatants would feel it shake slightly before the entire section they were in broke apart alongside the collapsed house. And both Tanjiro and Kamado would find themselves falling into the cold dark waters below, followed by a great deal of debris and rubble. As they went underwater and had their worlds consumed by almost complete darkness. Tanjiro would for a moment feel something warm and metallic graze at his foot before it sunk to the depths underneath a great deal of wood and stone. With him rising back to the surface and taking a deep breath, before starting to swim with struggle towards the beach located by the pier. It was a long swim, and it would take a while, especially with his broken arm, but by the time he finally reached dry sand, he'd just numbly let go of the broken katana he'd carried all the way with him before dryly collapsing on his back, breathing heavily as he stared out into the sky above. Tanjiro tried his best to get as much rest as he could without giving in to his own tiredness and falling unconscious. He stayed there a while, he wasn't sure how long, but by the time he was disturbed from his rest the sky had began changing color from a black to a very dark blue, fading to a lighter shade along the horizon, signaling the approaching dawn. That though was the good news. The bad news and what had shaken him from his rest though was, inevitably enough, the smell he'd been waiting for. Sure enough, he'd look up, and finally emerging from the waves was the still metal-coated figure of Kamado, immediately locking eyes on Tanjiro as he walked towards the shore. The demon slayer in turn narrowed his eyes as he sat up, but would silently reach for the broken katana he dropped in the sand as he used his good arm to help himself back to his feet. His body still aching and tired, but at least not holding itself together on pure adrenaline anymore now that he'd had a chance to rest a bit. He knew this was coming from the start though. Demons didn't need to breathe, sinking to the bottom of the ocean even under that debris only served to slow him down slightly, so of course the bastard would come back. Regardless, he'd undress and drop his wet and heavy houri on the sand before walking towards sea in order to meet the demon. As Kamado emerged from the ocean and Tanjiro made his way towards it, the two of them would eventually find themselves standing some 30 feet across from one another. The infinite vastness of the sea on one end and Kaigara on the other, a burning pier lining the background as they faced each other in the silent beach. Neither said a word for a moment, the blowing wind and the crashing waves being the only sounds either would hear. Finally though, it was the demon who chose to break the silence. So was that your plan? Running around until dawn comes and waiting for the sun to burn me up? He asked, calmer than before. Don't think I can't still kill you and hide away before the sun even comes up. No, Tanjiro responded, I'm actually done running. Too tired for that, he admitted while raising his broken katana. No matter happens, this fight is ending in the next blow. Kamado smirked, letting out a small chuckle. Ah, at last something we can agree on, he said, raising his left arm as its length once again morphed into a blade. You know, you're an annoying and pestering brat, and I'll take joy in killing you. But you are also the one that pushed me the farthest in a fight since I became a demon. You can die being proud of that. Tanjiro didn't respond, opting to stick with a blank expression as he held down his broken katana to the side, gripping it tightly while breathing in deeply. Despite the pain in his left arm, he managed to lower it enough so his hand could hold the scabbard while the other one returned the blade to it as so to draw it in the most optimal moment. Both opponents stared each other down silently, one's grin contrasted to the other's poker face, yet neither of them showed any sign of movement. A wave crashed onto the shore around them and stretched out into the beach, drenching both their feet in their process. Neither dared to look away as the wave retracted back into the sea, and only once it had disappeared entirely did both of them move at once. Tanjiro and Kamado rushed at one another at an equal pace, quickly beginning to close distance with one another. As they approached each other, both knowing only one of them would live past the next exchange, time would slow down and the swordsman gripped his katana tighter. Moving to his opponent's left is to get the best chance at a clean hit from his position. Not yet. You only get one chance at this, so wait for the smell. 30 feet had quickly become 15, which turned to 10, and then to 5. At which point Kamado swung his darkened arm-turned blade horizontally with the clear objective of decapitating the swordsman just as he had been trying so hard to do to him. Tanjiro meanwhile, held on to drawing his blade yet, chanting to himself silently, Breath of the Sun, first dance. He held it, even when he felt the pressure building up beneath his scabbard. And as the lower moon's blade inched closer to his neck, he'd finally feel the scent draw it with one mighty swing, waltz. The dark blade was supposed to hit home first, of course, but Kamado was the slower of the two, which allowed Tanjiro's edge to intercept his own just as it approached the boy's neck. Even with the flames surrounding it, that one-handed swing wouldn't even have been enough to do anything more than scratch his skin. Or it should have. What happened instead was that both blades held their pressure for a moment against one another, before, inexplicably enough, Tanjiro's flame-coated white blade of Nichiren triumphed. Cutting through the dark iron and shortening the blade, just enough so the swing itself would miss the demon slayer's neck. As for Kamado, he'd barely be allowed to have his shock at the situation settle as Tanjiro's katana continued on its trajectory, an upwards diagonal line straight for his neck. The blade bit in, catching it at his throat, but not quite managing to pierce through all the way. Its wielder however would grip it tighter and try to put the full pressure of both their matched momentum to his blade as he cried out determinedly. Which in turn gave Tanjiro the last necessary push to make it. His blade cutting all the way through the dark iron of Kamado's neck and finally relieving lower moon 6 of his head as they both rushed past one another. Body and head alike hitting the ground as the swordsman stumbled and collapsed to the ground on his knees. It was inexplicable. It was nonsensical. It was impossible. Those were the things going through Kamado's head the moment after he noticed its separation from his neck. He knew for a fact that Tanjiro Kamado was stronger than any of the 126 demon slayers he'd bested in the past, rank be damned. But not even for a moment in this battle before the decisive clash in the beach did he even imagine that he'd be brought down like this. It simply made no sense that this boy would be able to cut through dark iron with that one flimsy attack when every other attempt of his to do so had failed. With his still dark iron-coated head dully hitting the sand, Kamado would stare at Tanjiro's back as the demon slayer remained kneeled while panting. He would glance tiredly over his shoulder at the decapitated demon moon, and though the still very much so shocked demon didn't utter a word, his thoughts seemed to get through to the swordsman. You wanna know how? How I managed to cut through your neck here when every other time I tried was a total failure. Kamado didn't respond, but the way he was staring still made it clear he indeed waited an answer, and Tanjiro would sigh before raising his broken katana, the flames in it having long faded. And staring off into its blade, a good swordsman should know his own katana. He explained. When a blade is freshly forged, still burning red from the flames with which it was molded, swordsmiths tend to have it undergo a water treatment in order to cool down the metal. This is known as quenching, a very delicate procedure made to strengthen the steel. However, if done wrong, it can have the opposite effect. The metal loses its ability to bend and adapt under stress. All you need then is one good blow, and it snaps. The decapitated demon took a moment, but slowly widened his eyes as the implication of Tanjiro's words began dawning upon him. The pier. The fire. Falling into the sea. Did you plan all that? More or less. I did what I could with what I have. The demon slayer admitted, lowering his blade as he stared up into the sky. There was no real way of knowing if it would work in the first place. Different metals, different reactions after all. In the end though, I guess it paid off. Kamado only stared silently at the demon slayer before him. Had his fight gotten only slightly differently, had they not ended up close to that burning pier, this would have proved a certain win for him. And yet they didn't. He'd been outsmarted, and now there he lay, slowly dying as the dark iron coating his head only slowed his eventual disintegration ever so slightly. Tanjiro would rise back up to his feet then with some difficulty, looking over at the fallen demon. My promise has been kept. The dead are avenged and you won't be hurting humans anymore, he said, looking down for a moment before glancing back at Kamado one last time. The look on his face not one of hatred or anger any longer, but strangely, he almost seemed sympathetic. I honestly hope you can find some closure with the time you have left. With that said, he'd begin walking off in a stumble towards Kaigara. His pace was slow and his steps pained, and he'd make it all of 50 feet before his body gave in and he collapsed entirely on the sand. The weight of all the fighting seemingly overwhelming his body. Kamado just watched in silence all the way, and while normally he'd find something so human to be utterly pathetic, it instead left him with an unexpected feeling. One he never thought he'd feel for a demon slayer of all people. What he felt was an odd sense of jealousy towards Tanjiro. He'd been a demon for so long, he'd almost forgotten. But he wasn't always a feared demon moon, and he wasn't always a demon. No, he wasn't even always Kamado. His name, his human name, had once been Kaharu. Before he had all this power, he was the bastard son of the head of the renowned Tetsuki clan, who'd gained their great wealth through their exploits as navigators of olden times, sailing to distant lands and bringing back all sorts of goods. His mother was a servant to the family, and her affair with the head had apparently resulted in him being born. She died of disease when he was still young, so he worked most of his youth as a servant himself in the family house. His father's wife despised his existence, and his two older half-brothers even more so, while his father was completely indifferent to his existence. He remembered more than once being beaten nearly to death by his brothers, and no one ever batted an eye. His father had died when he was 14, and the eldest son of the family took his place. Life turned into hell for him after that. One of the few memories he'd always retained from his human life even so many years later was when he ended up tripping while carrying a tray of tea and accidentally burning the younger of his older brothers, and in turn had the symbol of the family branded right on his face with hot iron, the Tetsuki's iron anchor, indicating him as basically property of the family from then on to the day he died. That day, as it turns out, wasn't that far off. It wasn't long after that incident that Kaharu would give in to his despair and run off into the woods at night to try and commit suicide. He would have succeeded too, hadn't it been for Muzan Kibutsuji discovering him. That man would give him his second chance at a life, and he would be reborn as Kamado. His first act with his newly gained power was to butcher every single last member of the Tetsuki family, leaving him as the last of a century-old bloodline. He was a powerful demon from the start, and the power he'd gained was intoxicating. He'd devour humans by the dozens with no remorse in order to increase that power, while torturing other demons he'd came across for fun and to test his strength. And when demon slayers began coming after him, he'd slaughter them too. It was 5 years before he first developed his demon blood art, and even if it was far less powerful as to what would become of it, he had become convinced by then that unlike his human self, he stood above every other creature on earth with the exception of Muzan himself, the true top of the food chain. Throughout his life, however, that concept would come to be defied and remolded 3 times. The first had been 20 years ago, when he first came across a pillar, a man with long, orange and red hair, as well as a crimson blade of Nichiren. He thought the man to be just like any of the previous demon slayers he'd come across, but he was wrong. The flame pillar had nearly decapitated him, cutting 3/4 of the way into his neck with the one slash. The only reasons he'd survived that day were the dark iron surrounding his neck that managed to just barely stop that flaming katana and the cliff he'd leapt of in order to escape the demon slayer. That was when he learned there were humans capable of surpassing demons with sheer technique, and the thought of once again being underneath someone in this food chain once again made him furious. Even if at the time he wasn't quite sure why. The second time was years later, when he'd been pursuing this spider-like demon girl around the vicinities of Natagumo Mountain. And he'd come across the previous holder of the rank he'd come to hold himself. Lower Moon 6 Rui. At the time, he'd heard about demon moons from other demons, but he thought that's still just a myth, and he unwisely attacked the demon as well. Rui had made short work of him, as the strings he controlled had enough cutting power in them to pierce even his dark iron. Of course, even if he mutilated his foe again and again, he still had no real way of killing him, so despite all the pain he'd go through, Kamado would still be able to escape from the strings holding him up to be consumed by sunlight and run off from Natagumo Mountain. Rather than being demoralized though, this had a different effect on him. Firstly, he now knew that even though he wasn't on top of the food chain, there were higher ranks to strive for yet so he could climb higher and higher. Secondly, with enough power he might even be able to do much like Rui had done and assemble a group of demons to work under himself. He'd get stronger in the following years as he was further motivated to become one of the demon moons himself, eating more and more humans. 5 years ago was when he'd come across Hinamaru and Nobiru, weaker demons with potential, trying to survive. He'd beat them both down and forced them into an agreement under him, forcing both to don the same mark as himself in a show of loyalty. With the two helping him, they'd be able to acquire even more humans for them to devour while discreetly moving from town to town. And in time as more members joined, this would come to be known as the Tetsuki Gang, the name subconsciously taken from his own former clan despite not even remembering it anymore at that point. And then finally, only 2 years ago, he'd be met by Muzan again, and finally given the rank he'd pined for during so many years. That night he was officially named Lower Moon 6, but even then, he remembered that before Muzan left he managed to gather enough courage and ask him exactly what he had to do in order to ascend further into the demon moons. What was necessary for one like himself to become an upper moon demon? Lower moons like yourselves kill demon slayers. Upper moons however kill pillars. That is the difference between the two, he'd said, which surprised Kamado given his own experience with a pillar. If you wish to ascend, the only thing you can do is grow stronger and stronger. Then kill me a pillar. That should be the bare minimum you can do if you have any chance of becoming an upper moon. That day, for the first time in his life, he'd felt like he knew his own place in the order of things. He'd risen to become one of the strongest demons, yet he was still in a way at the bottom. He tried hard to expand his gang, to become a stronger demon worthy of his title, someone who could kill a pillar. He'd even fed his own demon moon blood to his underlings, allowing them to awaken their own demon blood arts and become stronger themselves. He'd just taken his first step as a demon moon, and would do anything he could to become worthy of ascending the ranks even further. But then came the third and final time. Today, when he met Tanjiro Kamado and had the very place he stood on in this world-defied door the last time. He was able to tell very quickly that the boy was strong. And had been agitated when seeing him use similar flames to the ones that nearly took his life years ago when he came face to face with a pillar. And yet, he never imagined that a mere demon slayer, who the very progenitor of all demons said he should be able to kill by his very nature, would turn the tides on him and claim his head. And yet somehow it happened. No matter how many times he knocked the boy down, no matter how ferociously he attacked, Tanjiro would just get up again and again, until he finally managed to slay his foe. His whole life he'd fled and cowered against those stronger than himself, be it his brothers, the Flame Pillar or even a fellow Lower Moon, while bullying the meek he came across. The various humans he'd slain and several dozen demon slayer who never stood a chance against his dark iron. Until Tanjiro came along, and even when everything said he should fall, he'd risen up to the odds and beaten them. He did everything Kamado ever wanted to do, but was too afraid to risk doing. So yes, he was jealous. But mixed with that was an odd sense of admiration. As ash began fully consuming him, he spent his last moments of sight to briefly watch the unconscious demon slayer lying there on the beach. Tanjiro had kept his promise, and even with a broken blade he'd still managed to cut straight through his meek food chain philosophy. He could only wonder how far someone like that would go in this world. Sighing mentally, he turned his gaze away, back into the sea, and spent his last few moments watching as the first rays of light pierced the horizon. Before a wave came and engulfed his decapitated head. By the time it was gone, so was he, his ashes washed away by the sea. End of chapter. If you enjoyed this chapter then like, comment, and subscribe for more. See you all in the next video, peace out.